All right. How are we doing? Doing good. You guys. So in LA, I've taught the Book of Genesis a few times at there's a Bible Institute, and so what we do is I think it's 16 weeks, 2-hour lectures, so it's 32 hours I go through Genesis, and you're getting it in less than 4. So I'm trying to edit and not give you the complete fire hose treatment. So I want to go back because this was the climax of the Book of Genesis. So I want to make sure I did this right because the next section is important. So Genesis 1 through 4 is really kind of prologue-ish. The way I read Genesis, that Toledot in Genesis 5:1, I think starts the story. This is the story of man, and it's a story of death. So the backdrop and the backstory is important because all we've lived in is a world where sin and death reign. That's what we know. And so as God commissions Israel in Exodus 19, he gives them that backstory of 1 through 4. And then when you get to Genesis 5, you have the story of death in chapter 5, our sin in chapters 6, 7, and 8, the flood. You have and 9, and then you have the Tower of Babel in 10 and 11. So the first 11 chapters just say how bad the problem is and how overwhelming it is. And you have to feel that because it is. I mean, Satan is the god of this world. We're spiritually dead. In Ephesians chapter 2, it talks about us walking according to the prince of the power of the air, and we're by nature children of wrath as the rest. But it says we walked in accordance to, we walk in agreement with the prince of the power of the air. That's how creation is moved. People walk in solidarity and agreement with Satan. So that's just the creation. That's the world that we now live in. And so Genesis opens up by you feeling the weight of that problem. And then in chapters 12 through 25, what I just tried to cover, it just simply is, that's the section of Genesis, the Toledot section where you get the promise. That God is going to fulfill what he promised in Genesis 3:15. And it flushes it out. And it flushes it out in a narrative theology that is teaching theology. It's not just a story. And it's teaching the theology of how God is going to do this. How is God going to restore what was lost? How is God going to bring us alive who were dead? How is God going to exalt us back to be able to have dominion over creation again? How does that happen? And so Genesis 12 through 25 makes that clear. God, he makes this promise. He cuts a covenant that he walks it alone, so he's going to pay the price for our debt. And then you get to chapter 22, and you see how. It gives you a picture of the how. And turn with me in the New Testament to John chapter 8. So if I say too much about Jesus in the book of Genesis, the Old Testament, someone may say I'm reading the New Testament back into the Old Testament. But Jesus on the road to Emmaus says, no, you're not. People aren't reading enough out of Genesis that's there. It's not like you're reading stuff into it. You're just not reading enough out of it. And to see enough out of it, you have to keep rereading it. And if you keep rereading it, you'll see that it's there. And what you will see is what Abraham saw. So Abraham saw something about, when God says, there's nothing too wonderful for me to do. And in John chapter 8, this is what Jesus says about Abraham when he said this great I am statement. I'm going to jump right in the middle of this thing. In chapter 8, verse 52, and then the Jews said, now we know you have a demon. Abraham died, and so did the prophets. You say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? And the prophets died. Who do you claim to be? In verse 54, if I glorify myself, Jesus answered, my glory is nothing. My Father, about whom you say he is our God, he is the one who glorifies me. You do not know him, but I know him. And if I were to say I don't know him, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. So Abraham knew that God was promising a seed. That's the Bible's storyline. It tells us that from Genesis 3:15. I see that in Genesis 4 when it starts off by Eve looking for the seed. And the reader of the Bible from that point should keep looking for the seed because he's the answer. He's the one who restores by crushing the serpent's head. And so Abraham looked, and Abraham saw, in that Genesis 22 account, he connected the dots. He said, so he knew, at that point he believed God was going to do it because God had given him a son at 100 years old. He says, God really is going to do the seed thing. He's going to provide the seed miraculously. He doesn't need my cultural help. He doesn't need me he is just going to do this like he vowed to do. And so when you read Genesis chapter 15, that a price had to be paid if a part of the covenant had been breached. And what Genesis 12 through 25 is showing you over and over again, that Abraham is a sinner. So in Romans 4, verse 4 and 5, it says that, and actually turn there with me. Hold just about here and go to Romans 4. In Romans 4, it says this. We like to make our Old Testament characters heroes, but they're not the hero of the story. And we shouldn't do that. Romans chapter 4, I'm going to read verse 3 through 5. And it says, and I switched translations. This is one I normally read out of, so I'm more familiar with what's on the page. It says in Romans 4, verse 3, for what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and his faith, was credited to him for righteousness. Now to the one who works, pay is not credited as a gift, but as something owed. But to the one who does not work, and that's Abraham, but believes on him who declares the ungodly to be righteous, his faith is credited for him for righteousness. Abraham's faith was credited for him for righteousness. But the clause before that says, God declared an ungodly person righteous. He declares so Abraham was unrighteous. He was ungodly, and God declared him righteous by faith. And so when you read the story, it's like, yeah, he ain't righteous. But Abraham was saved by faith. And what did he believe in? What was he trusting in? And Jesus says the gospel doesn't change. God saves through the one who would come and pay the price for sin, the seed of the woman. So Abraham saw that and trusted that. And then let me give you two other New Testament texts. Turn with me to Hebrews chapter 11. And it talks about Abraham's faith, the content of it. Having faith doesn't save you, is what you're trusting in. Abraham believed in God, and he believed how God would save. It says in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, when it begins to talk about the faith of those before us, and of Abraham, it says, and let me drop down verse 17, chapter 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He received the promise, and yet he was offering his one and only son, the one to whom it had been said, your seed, your offspring, will be called through Isaac. He considered God to be able even to raise someone from the dead. Therefore, he received him back, figuratively speaking. So when it says Abraham considered, that's what was going on in Genesis chapter 12. He says, if I obey God, God will raise him back from the dead because God is going to bless all the families of the earth through him. So I'm not reading my New Testament backwards into what's not in the Old Testament. The Old Testament narrative gives a theology. And when Abraham is doing this, God says, now I know you fear me. I know you're trusting what I said I would do. And that's blessed through that seed. Let me give you one other text. And in Galatians chapter 3, verse 16. So does the collective seed save, or is it really from Genesis 3:15 forward, the singular seed from the woman who would save? Because you have a one and a many theology going back and forth throughout the Old Testament, starting from Genesis chapter 12 forward. When God makes this promise to Abraham, the rest of your Old Testament, you're reading how God is fulfilling this promise to Abraham. Multiply seed, make them a great nation. That's what you're reading from Genesis chapter 12 to the end of the Old Testament, like God fulfilling this promise to Abraham. So he grows a collective seed, gives them the land, makes them a nation, gives them a king. You're just watching Genesis 12 flesh itself out when you read the rest of the Old Testament. But is it the collective seed that saves? Because you watch it, they're going to be like the sand of the seashore, and so you watch all that. But Genesis 3:15 said, but one of them, not the collective seed, one of them is going to crush the serpent's head. And so in Galatians 3:16, it says, now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. And I've gone through this, like if I say seed or offspring, is it many, is it one? And the pronouns define that in Genesis, and they did. And so Abraham knew what we should know from reading Genesis. He does not say to seeds as though referring to many, but referring to one, and to your seed, who is Christ. And that's Genesis 22, verse 17. And unfortunately, the New American Standard, a lot of our English translations, my Christian Standard Bible, pluralizes that whole text, but it's not. It's one out of the many. It's one seed. So Paul isn't reading like as, giving an inspired text, but he's reading something that wasn't in Genesis. He's reading what Genesis actually says. Grammatically and literally and syntactically and culturally and historically, that's just what Genesis 22 is saying. So go back there and let me show you in Genesis chapter 22. In Genesis chapter 22, and so collective nouns, and we have a lot of them, like they're singular in form, but they're plural. I can say the team is going, and team is plural. I don't say the team are going. The team, but I'm going to put a singular verb with it. Does it work, honey? That won't work? My wife's a grammarian. Huh? Sheep? Yeah, sheep. Okay. Sheep. Yeah. So you have these collective nouns. So they're singular in form, but they're grammatically connected. So you want to put they with them pronouns. You want a plural pronoun to go with them. And in Genesis chapter 22, the translators know that is a collective noun. So they want to put a plural pronoun with it, but the Hebrew is singular. In Genesis chapter 22, verse 17, it says, I will indeed bless you and make your seed as numerous as the stars. So I have seed or offspring here. Is it plural or singular? It tells me it's plural because it says as numerous as the stars. So that's the collective seed. That's definitely plural. And it says not only the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. That's collective. And what I'm saying, the next sentence, the seed is singular. So I'm going to read, your seed singular, he will possess the gates of his enemies. Why? Because the pronoun in front of enemies is a masculine singular pronoun. Some translations will have it pluralized, but it should have a footnote. The ESV has his enemies, right? Who has the ESV? Raise your hand for me. Whose translation has plural, their enemies? All right, so just nobody? Okay. So my Christian Standard Bible says their enemies, and the New American Standard says their enemies. I almost want to say the NIV does too. And what they're trying to do, okay, all right, let me geek out and get nerdy for 1 second. All right. So what you have to do with pronouns, because they rename the noun, they have to agree. But if it's a collective noun, but the context is plural, what they would do sometimes in the Hebrew, even if there's a singular pronoun grammatically, some would argue that the writer's giving you the singular pronoun, not notionally, but he's only giving you a singular pronoun to agree grammatically. But contextually, you let it be plural because, in fact, it's a plural referent. And so that's why in our English Bibles they say they, because you look sand of the seashore and stars of the heaven. So that's obviously plural. So they would say, well, he's only saying he in the Hebrew because he's agreeing grammatically with a collective noun being singular in form. But is Moses doing that? Because Genesis 3:15, he had a singular referent. You had her multiple offspring of the woman, and then one of them crushing the serpent's head. I'm saying Moses does that the rest of the Torah. He has this one out of the many theology. And here that's what he's doing. And because his enemies are singular, then and that's renaming the collective noun, your seed, offspring, will possess the gates of their enemy, then that offspring is singular too. So the sentence starts off plural, but it ends up with this his enemies. And so his is masculine singular. So the offspring there is like me saying, I went to the movies with my seed and he had a good time. I could just say, I went to dinner with my offspring and they ate me out of house and home. And then I went to the movies with my seed and he had. So I can talk about all of my kids and then I can say I did something with one of my sons. So here Moses is saying that there is a collective seed, but when it comes to crushing the enemies, there's only one who subdues the head of the serpent. And it says, your seed, singular, he will possess the gates of his enemies. And then if I keep reading, it's singular at this point. So when you have a pronoun, it's going to rename the closest noun. So it's going to be singular from this point forward. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed by him, your seed, because you have listened to my voice. Did I lose anybody? All right, okay. So so when you read Genesis, you want to, and you have to keep rereading it, but Genesis 3:15 is telling you look for the one out of the many, and I think that's what Moses is doing here. But also what it does, and it does it pretty repeatedly, it starts giving you patterns. And so let me slide forward and just show you like the patterns that you have to follow. So Sarah dies in chapter 23, and in order for the seed to continue, Isaac has got to get a wife. So they send Isaac back to her family, and so he gets a wife. That's the only way the seed is going to continue. And then you have Abraham dies in chapter 25, but then the seed line continues then through Isaac, and I'm in chapter 25, verse 19. And these are this translation says records. This is the genealogy, the Toledoth. This is the story about Isaac, the son of Abraham. This is what happens to Isaac, the son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took as his wife Rebekah, daughter from Bethuel, the Aramean from Padan Aram, and sister of Laban, the Aramean. And Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. God has given us a story that's going to keep repeating that when it comes to the seed line, he does something miraculous. He intervenes directly to keep the seed line going because it's his seed line. So here, just like Sarah was barren, Rebekah, by God's sovereign will, she's barren until he intervenes. And the text says, Isaac prays, and the Lord was receptive to his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. She had twins, and it says 2 nations in verse 23 are in her womb. So you had Esau and Jacob. Those are the 2 seed lines. Esau is a seed line. Seed line. And so that's a seed line. And so then you have the seed line of Jacob. And the seed lines aren't in and of themselves righteous. Abraham wasn't. It says God is going to choose them, and God is going to teach them how to trust him. And so in the story of Jacob, and I may not go through the whole story, but when you read it, this is what you're reading. So Genesis 1-4, you have, now I'm oriented. I know where I'm at. I know I'm in the world of sin. I know why I'm in the world of sin. I know God is God. I know I'm not. And I know what the problem is, and I know the solution is he's going to send the seed of the woman. And then I see how bad the problem is in chapters 5 through 11. There's death, there's sin, there's mutiny against God. It's just a mess. And then I see the promise in 12 through 15. God is going to send one from the seed of the woman, one from the seed of Abraham, who's going to make everything right again. And I know how he's going to do it. I have a prophetic pattern picture in chapter 22. He's going to suffer. And I get the details of him being bruised on the hill in chapter 22. He's going to really suffer. But it's going to be a sacrificial substitutionary, like sacrifices are. So I have this promise that God is going to do it. But then I have, so I get the promise. So Jacob's story, the story about Isaac is going to be the story about Jacob. The question is, so now what do we do? I'm not Abraham. God gave this promise to Abraham, and I see that God is going to do it. So now what do we do? And the answer, and when you read from Genesis 26 through 36, the answer is, what do we do? We're not Abraham. You need to trust the God of Abraham, and he'll include you into this. You'll be a son of Abraham by faith. You need to believe. You need to believe the promise that God made to Abraham, that he's going to send a son, and that son, through his sacrifice, would make a people of God as broad as the stars of the sun, stars in the sky, and the sand on the seashore. You have to believe. And as God grants grace for us to believe, you have to learn how to believe. You have to learn how to trust God. What you need to be learning right now is how to walk with a faithful God, a good God, a patient God, a God who nothing is too wonderful for, but a God who's holy, and a God who does hate sin. You need to learn how to trust him and walk with him. And when I read the story of Jacob, that's what you're seeing. You're watching him learn that's what you need to do. So we have a Bible, and we need to be learning how to read it with faith. And it's telling me to trust the one who God gave, who rescues me and sanctifies me. I need to learn how to trust him. And that's what that's what we are learning how to do. Genesis, I'm not going to try to necessarily exposit Genesis 26 through 36 like I just try to do 12 to 25. But that's the gist of it. If you read it, I think that's what it's doing. But hermeneutically, I want to point out a couple things to you, just so you know, this is, as a genre, this is what it's doing, so I don't miss what it's teaching. So chapter 26, verse 1, it says, there was another famine in the land in addition to the one that had occurred. So it's connecting me back. So you have these hyperlinks. And so what you do when you teach something, you have to keep repeating yourself over and over and over again until they get it. So Genesis is just going to keep repeating itself with patterns and pictures, and it wants you to connect them. I've read this before, I've seen this. Oh, and that's what faith looks like. And that's what it doesn't look like. And I want to learn how to walk in faith. So it says, there was another famine in the land in addition to the one that had occurred in Abraham's time, and Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, at Gerar, and the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Tells him not to do that. And so he stays in the land. In verse 7, and when the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, she is my sister. And for he was afraid, but she ain't really a sister. He's straight out lying this time. Abraham was only a half lie. This is a full lie, but he's Abraham 2.0. Okay, we laugh, and you know who you are? You're Abraham 3.0. You've got to learn how to trust God. You simply have to learn. You have to learn. It's about God. And he doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He was so wonderful. He opened up Sarah's womb at 90 years old. What is it your God can't do for you? Does your faith look like that? And you have to learn how to trust him. He's patient. And he will teach you how to trust him. So, my 8-year-old daughter started having neck pains. And so my background is I was a trainer. I got hired as a trainer at 16 years old. and I study kinesiology, and I'm a trainer. So her neck is stiff. She had spent the night with a friend, and somehow she woke up with a head on the radio, so she had a stiff neck. So the kinesiologist in me is like, baby girl, if you leave it stiff, it's going to get worse. You got to move your neck. But it really hurts, Daddy. Just suck it up and move your neck. Like, you got to move your neck. And it just persisted. The next week, we took her to the hospital. Another week, we took her to the hospital. And it's getting worse. And she's spiking temperatures, laying on the couch. And so one night, she stayed at Grandma's house. Grandma lives like a half a mile away. And when my wife she came home that night without, my daughter's name is Carissa. She came home without Carissa. And I'm like, honey, where's Carissa? And she wasn't feeling well enough to come home. I'm like, it's a half a mile. You can run it in 2 minutes. So anyway, that night, I was really praying, like, Lord, show me what's wrong with my daughter. And we got a call from Grandma, what was it, 2 o'clock in the morning, something like that? That Carissa couldn't stand up. She had to go to the bathroom, but she couldn't stand up. So I pick her up, and we take her to the hospital, and the doctor came out and said that she had leukemia. And it was like I'm watching like this out-of-body experience. I'm like, no, she's 8 years old. It don't work like that. But I live outside the garden. I don't live in Genesis 1 and 2. You don't live in Genesis 1 and 2. We live outside the garden. And death is no respect of persons. So so I take her to the doctor, and the nurses were all optimistic, saying, well, we've made a lot of progress with leukemia, and so we can, we have treatments for ALL, was the childhood form of leukemia. And so we're wanting to trust the Lord. And then another nurse came in later, and she started talking about and then she caught herself because she's watched our response. He said, you haven't talked to the doctor yet? I'm like, no. And the doctor came and said she doesn't have ALL. She had the AML, which is the adult version of leukemia, that's super aggressive. You die within a matter of weeks and months. And so, and most kids weren't surviving. So, I caught myself. It was, I just couldn't get my mind around it. And so he started giving us these options, these experimental protocols, to try to, because kids weren't surviving the protocols they had at the time. So I asked one of my friends to come because I just didn't know if I could even listen. He was talking, I'm looking at him I couldn't even hear. And so he started walking through, and I had to sign this thing. So he said, if this doesn't work, then she can die this way, and she can die this way, and she can get this, and she can die that way. Okay, sign on line number 4. I'm like, so we signed up on this experimental protocol, and everything that could go wrong went wrong. There was one potential side effect where she could get a liver disease that could kill her. She got the liver disease. The first day we were in the hospital, her blood pressure just was plummeting down into the teens, and people are running into the room, yelling. My wife and I just holding each other, crying. And so I'm praying for my daughter. But at one point, God just convicted me. I literally was praying God, you said, if we ask you for a fish, you won't give us a serpent. If we ask you for bread, you won't give us a stone. And I'm pleading for my daughter's life. I was just praying. And then God convicted me, and I was just painfully aware I wasn't saying, but not my will, your will be done. There was, from my mind, I couldn't get my mind around the possibility of this being God's will. I'm just pleading with God to save my daughter. And I'll be a little probably too detailed. So I don't know if you might want to edit this part out for me. But God helped me and my wife. We prayed and just said, whatever God does, we know he's good. And then it got to a point where, because I said everything that went wrong could go wrong, she was dying. And I asked the doctors, and they said, we've done everything we could do. I just said, it's my daughter dying. And they said, we've done what we can do. Everybody in the hospital thought she was going to die. Out of the 5 families we went through this with, we went to 4 funerals, and she was sicker than everybody. Everything was way worse on her, and they all died. And so a lot of these beautiful bald-headed girls. That's the life outside the garden. So it got to a point where they just were concerned that she couldn't breathe. And so if you can't breathe strongly, then your CO2 builds up in your body and that's toxic. You have to, you take in oxygen, gets used in your body, you exhale it as CO2. If you can't breathe, you can't blow it out, and it becomes toxic in your body and you die. And so the benchmark level was like 60. And if it gets over 60, they were going to have to put on a ventilator. And they were all prepared to do that. And my wife and I had to be there 24/7. It was my night to be at the hospital. And they came in the room. And I had been asking everybody, pray that they won't have to put my daughter on a ventilator. And so I forgot, 3 o'clock in the morning, whatever time it was, they came in and they said her CO2 levels are over 60. They're at 62. We have to put her on a ventilator. And when they put kids at 8 on a ventilator, they sedate you, they put the ventilator and they strap you down so you don't pull it out. And then you can't breathe, so it's a matter of time. So I thought before they do all that, I wanted my wife there because it may be the last time we got a chance to talk to our daughter. So I called my wife and she didn't pick up her phone. And I called the house phone, she didn't pick up the phone. She had slept in the girls' room and her phone was in the living room. And I didn't know what to do, that my wife couldn't be there. And the nurse looked at me when the doctors in the hallway setting everything up. And the nurse looked at me and said, Dad, if you're not comfortable with this, they can't do it. Now I advise people, follow your doctor's advice. But she said, Dad, if you're not comfortable, they can't do this. So the doctor came in and I just said, I'm not comfortable. I don't want to do this. Right now I want to wait. And the doctor almost snapped. She said, I've consulted, because nobody wants to do this, right? I've consulted every doctor on the floor. And the head doctor of a pediatrics ICU was on the floor that night. And he said, we consulted him. He said, we have to do this right now. She could go into cardiac arrest. She could die right now. We have to do this right now. And I looked back at her and I said, I'm not comfortable doing this right now. I want to pray. And I thought she was going to call the police and get me arrested. She was so mad. So I just said, I wanted, because I wanted my wife there. And so they walked out of the room and left the machine there. And she walked out of the room. And I got on my knees and I just prayed and I pleaded. But this time, not my will, your will be done. And my daughter tells a story to have your dad kneeling beside your bed praying all night long. And her CO2 went from 62 to 58 the next hour, from 58 to 55, from 55 to 52, and by the morning it was normal, and we were home the next week. And she's married and 28 years old, and the cutest little thing you ever want to see, because it affected her. So she's like 90 pounds, she's this tall, just a cute, I'll show you pictures of her. But my wife and I, the Lord had taught us that if he takes her, that's not how I write the story, but God didn't give me the pen. He writes our stories, and he's good. And my wife said if she had to go through that, she said she would go through that again because what she learned about God. Now, her faith is greater than mine, obviously. I'm like, I don't want to ever go through nothing like that again. Please, Lord. But it just drew us so close to God because we live not by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And God's going to teach you that. I don't know what your trials are. They're coming. I don't know what your test is. They're coming. Because God is simply bigger than that. And what Jacob has to learn is what we have to learn, that God has vowed in covenant, and he is not going to blink. He is going to bring, through his son, a restoration of everything. And no matter what our enemy does, and the seed of the serpent does, death included, through Cain, he kills Abel. Death is a part of the conflict. Some of us will die. But when God saves, he saves. And that's John chapter 8, that he is greater than death. And those who trust in you won't taste death. How can you say that? Are you greater than Abraham and the prophets? Yeah, I'm greater than Abraham and the prophets, infinitely so. So we just have to trust. We have to learn. And so that you have all these 2.0s in Jacob's life, just reminding us that we're going to have a 3.0 life. So he gets tested with famine, and he has to trust. His wife is barren. He has to trust, and that's just how. That's the story. That's just how it works. Let me try to walk us through parts of Genesis 26 through 36 and show you just hermeneutically, like some things you can look at and see how to read it. So in chapter 27, you have this fight over the first seed blessing, because the seed line, well, let me just say, I know that Isaac isn't the singular chosen seed. So the story is going to go forward. But it's going to go through from Abraham through Isaac, and is it going to go through Jacob or Esau? I'm going to read the text. And so Esau is the firstborn. He came out first. So it would go through Esau. But Esau, and you have this battle between the brothers, who like trying to, well, at least Jacob wants it. And so he swindled him with a meal to get the firstborn right. And then, Isaac thinks he's about to die in chapter 27. And so the mother, Rebekah, it says in verse 5, now Rebekah was listening to what Isaac said to his son Esau, that he wanted him to go in the field and hunt and get him something. And so Rebekah turns to Jacob, verse 11, and wants him to dress up like his brother and deceive Isaac so he can get the blessing. But you can't help God. You don't, like Rebekah knew from the promise God gave her when the boys were born that the younger would be the greater. So she knows that, but instead of trusting God, she's going to have Jacob dress up like Esau, and she's going to cook a meal. And he says in verse 13, his mother said to him, verse 12, suppose my father touches me. I'm in 27, verse 12. Suppose my father touches me, then I will be revealed to him as a deceiver and bring a curse rather than a blessing on myself. And that's the storyline. That for us, it is by faith that we would experience being in the blessing of the seed line, and he doesn't want to be in the cursed seed line. As Rebekah says, let your curse be on me, but just listen to my voice. And that's the same language of what Adam did. He listened to the voice of his wife when she told him to eat of the fruit that God commanded him not to do. So this listening language, are you going to trust God and be loyal to God? Or are you going to listen to your mom? And so he listens to his mom. He dresses up. He deceives Jacob. Jacob gives him the blessing. And Esau, he left nothing for, so basically his firstborn right was given to Jacob and not Esau. But it just reiterates what you're reading is a seed line story, the conflict in between them. But they don't always, even those in the seed line don't always walk by faith. That's something we have to learn how to do. And so I'm watching Jacob. He's a swindler. He's a deceiver. It got so bad at this point that Esau said that when they thought their dad was dying, that Esau is so angry. Look with me at 27, in the chapter 27. He was raging in his anger so bad. He said when his father's anger subsided, that he was going to kill Jacob. And that's back to Genesis chapter 4, where Cain kills Abel. In between these seed lines, there can be murderous intent because Satan he murdered from the beginning, and that's what he uses in this conflict. He'll deceive, he murders, but anyway, that's how he battles. So Jacob has to leave. And when he's leaving in chapter 28, verse 10 and following, God visits him, and he sees Jacob's ladder, and God makes this promise now to Jacob. And I'm going to read the story and watch how he responds by faith to this promise that God now makes for him. He gets a wife, and he goes and he finds Rachel, and he wants to marry Rachel, but he meets a deceiver that's greater than he is. He meets Laban, and Laban gives him the older daughter before he gives him the younger daughter. And so you have him getting deceived. But when you look at, because the seed line has to multiply at some point, so, and as you have Leah and Rachel, but listen to how the story goes forward when the seed line has to continue. It says in Genesis chapter 29, in Genesis chapter 29, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb. Like he restores Sarah's womb. Isaac prays and God gives Rebekah a child. But Leah's womb is opened by God. And the sons she had, Levi and Judah, okay, her womb gets opened. And then you have all the cultural ways of helping. And then it says in the same chapter, chapter 30, verse 22, then God remembered Rachel, and he listened to her, and he opened up her womb. And that's just as a repeated prophetic pattern now. The seed line continues by God's direct intervention. So God opens up Leah's womb, he opens up Sarah's womb, he opened up Rebekah's womb, he opened up Sarah's womb. And so when the seed comes, the seed of the woman comes, God is going to do something amazing. And so you may not see that the first time you read the story, but as you keep rereading it, you see these patterns. So just hermeneutically, part of the God, keeping us on reading the story, seeing and looking for the seed of the woman, the Messiah, the coming man, to see that, the story uses prophetic patterns. And so when you get to like Isaiah 7:14, a virgin will conceive, you should be hyperlinked back to this. Your mind should go back to Rebekah and Rachel and Leah and Sarah. So anyway, that's hermeneutically, you want to see these prophetic patterns. There'll be Abraham 2.0s and Sarah 2.0s, and the patterns just repeat because God doesn't want you to miss how he's going to do this, how he's going to bless all the families of the earth. He's going to do it through a seed of the woman that he is going to be directly intervening and a part of. You know the story. Laban is trying to swindle Jacob. Jacob tries to swindle him back. Eventually, Jacob runs and leaves. And as he runs and leaves, he's going to go back and have to bump into Esau again. And the last time he saw Esau had said that he was going to kill him. And so he's going back to the land, but now he's wealthy. God had blessed him. He has much wealth. And so when he comes back, he sends a servant ahead of him to kind of like test the waters with where Esau was in chapter 32. And it says, and when the messengers returned to Jacob in verse 6, they said, we went to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and he has 400 men with him. So he's just terrified. And this is just a conflict between the seed lines. And so he's terrified that Esau, remembering what he had said, would kill him. And so he prays in chapter 32, and he wrestles with God all night long, as it were. And he's wrestling with God, and this is a Christophany, a theophany. Oh, okay. Christophany, theophany. But he sees God's face in this, that God visited him and touched his hip. He wouldn't let God go as he wrestles until God touched his hip. And so God promised to bless him. And then the climax of the story is that Esau comes back with these 400 men, but he comes back and they're reconciled. And so in chapter 33, it says in verse 10, no, he says, I have seen your face like seeing the face of God. And God had met Jacob when he wrestled with them. So what do we do with these promises? We have to learn how to trust God. He thought Esau was going to kill him, so he prays and pleads to God, and God graciously gave him favor with Esau. And Jacob saw it that way. And so in chapter 35, it says, I'm just jumping ahead. As the story moves forward, it says, and they're in the land of the Canaanites now. So Dinah gets raped, and Levi and Simeon, they kill this one group of people. So it's crazy in Shechem. But in chapter 35, it says, and I'm going to jump in here, read verse 2. Jacob said to his family and all who were with him, get rid of your foreign gods that are among you. Now, I don't know. He left and he was with Laban all these years, and he's coming back, and they still have idols. God had visited him twice. the promise that God made to Abraham, he passes along to Isaac and then Jacob. So Jacob is Abraham 3.0, received the Abrahamic covenant promise, and he still has idols. But when he wrestled with God and he saw God give him favor with his brother Esau, and he said, God is faithful. What he promises, he does. And so at this point it says, he tells his family, purify yourself. I'm in 35, verse 2. Get rid of your foreign gods. They're not God that are among you. Purify yourselves and change your clothes. We must get up and go to Bethel. I will build an altar there to God who answered me in the days of distress. He has been with me everywhere I have gone. It wasn't my swindling, my conniving that gave me the firstborn right. It wasn't my conniving that gave me wealth from Laban. It wasn't my conniving and my plan that gave me favor with Esau. God is just simply with those whom he has chosen, and he blesses us. And we have to learn how to trust him. And so what Jacob, chapter 26 to 36, what you see is what we ought to do with this promise God gave to Abraham. We have to learn how to trust God. And God is a good teacher. And I don't know how he's teaching you. I know if you know him, he's teaching you because he's just too wonderful not to see. And he wants you to see all of his mercy and all of his grace. And so he's teaching you to trust him and to walk with him. All right, I think I'm done. God bless you.